I'm Mo. It is March 3rd, and yesterday I finished my first book in March, so it is time to start another vlog-style reading wrap-up. March is one of my favorite readathon months. It is March Mystery Madness, which I love. March Mystery Madness runs all month. The first book that I read in March was Mad Mouse by Chris Gabenstein. I've had this book for many years, and actually I found a receipt from 2014 in it of a restaurant that I went to. I'm pretty sure I found this book at a used bookstore or a thrift shop or a stoop sale in Brooklyn, or free on a stoop in Brooklyn. I have been wanting to read it for quite a while because it is set on the Jersey Shore. I've kept it in my basement box books for many years. It was on my original booktube spin list for a little while, and then I took it off when I made my new booktube spin list and I put it in a try a chapter. I will link all the videos that I'm talking about and all the readathon information in the description box below, so make sure to check that out. Mad Mouse follows Danny Boyle, who is a 20-something seasonal cop on the Jersey Shore. He's worked for one summer and he was lucky enough to be partnered with an ex-military super cop, John Krepak. Krepak has a strict code of conduct and set of morals, and it's really rubbing off on Danny. He's excited to possibly become a full-time cop at the end of the summer, and he's looking forward to working more with Krepak. In the beginning of the summer and during the first book of this series, they solved a fairly high-profile murder. Although that maybe was too much excitement for Danny, he's looking forward to what the future holds. Unfortunately, in the second book in the series, Mad Mouse, Danny and his friends start getting targeted by a sniper. This sniper's MO is to hit people with paintballs to make it easier for them to be shot at with an actual rifle. Danny and Krepak have to connect all the dots with Danny and his friend group to figure out who the sniper is and what they want and why it has to do with the summer of 1996. So this is a very straightforward, silly cop procedural mystery, I guess. I like that Danny is a fresh cop and that he's kind of turning his life around. He was a little bit of a loser, and his most important things to do were go and drink with his friends or hang out on the beach until he joined the police force, and now he's really finding direction with his life and he's really enjoying helping people, which is a nice kind of wholesome take on this mystery. And then to be connected with Krepak, who is dealing with his PTSD from being in the army, coming back and having to live civilian lifestyle. There's a lot of balance that each main character is trying to find, which I really enjoyed. I also liked that even though this was the second book in the series, it was easy to jump into. They gave you enough clues for what happened in the first book and when it happened, the beginning of the summer that this book takes place. It's told in a very straightforward, clipped, short sentency kind of way, which I mostly associate with noir style books, and not actual noir books like Raymond Chandler, but books that want to emulate Raymond Chandler. So I feel like Gabenstein is probably a big fan of those noir books. He also writes children's books, and I think that that shows in this book as well, because this book really does have a very simple, simplistic way of writing. There is some repetitiveness to kind of hammer in the clues and the intent of the characters, which is not a detriment to the book, I don't think, but I think it does show that maybe this author is used to writing for a younger reading group. This was not a brilliant or amazing book. There was a good red herring at one point, and the kind of final big bad was an interesting twist on what it could have been. But overall, I don't think it was like particularly well written or totally amazing. It was very quick to get through. enjoyable. I do love that feeling of reading a book that's set in a place that you know. So this book is set in Sea Haven, New Jersey, but it's really set in Seaside Heights. It's pretty obvious the correlations between the actual locations and the fake locations made up in the book. I don't know a ton about Seaside Heights, but I know enough to recognize the different landmarks and things like that. I really liked that part of it, and that part definitely did make me feel clued in. I love that feeling of reading about someplace that you know and that you recognize. I love that kind of in-joke kind of feeling that you get. I will keep my eye out for the other books in this series, and certainly I would pick them up if I saw them at a book sale or a little free library or a used bookstore, but I will not be rushing out to get the sequels or the prequel to this book just because it wasn't good enough that I'm dying to read more. There are some other mysteries that I do that with, but this one won't be one of them. If you're interested in Jersey Shore mysteries, I would definitely suggest picking it up. Just a little bit of a warning, this book was written into 2006 and there definitely are some problematic phrases and languages that are used, but not as bad as it could have been. That was the first book that I read in March, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is March 6th, and I've read 2 more books in March. I read The Contractors by Lisa Ko. This is a short story novella that comes free with one of my subscriptions. As I mentioned last month, I really want to take advantage of reading as many of those free subscription books as I can so that I can get rid of that subscription. But I want to take advantage of the free books that are there because they are by really interesting and diverse authors, and they are things that I'm interested in reading. Short novella is about 2 women of Philippine descent who happen to share the same name, Sandra Guzman, and who happen to work at the same company. But one of the Sandras lives in New Jersey and her mother lives in the Philippines, and one lives in and works in the Philippines. They come in contact with each other when a reporter gets them confused. He wants to talk to Sandy, who lives in the Philippines, but he emails Sandra, who lives in New Jersey. I have to admit that one of the reasons I wanted to read this book was that I knew that Sandra lived in New Jersey. They end up becoming in contact with each other, so they learn about each other's jobs and a little about each other's lives. The company that they work for is quite evil and awful, and they eventually come to commiserate over that fact. This is an incredibly short book, so I wouldn't want to give anything away. It was read by an actress who is well known for some Disney something. I'm not sure what it was, and I didn't particularly like the reader. I thought that their tone was quite flat and it didn't hit all the beats that I would have liked it to hit emotionally from a reader, because I do think there are some like hard-hitting things in this short story. The Sandra who lives in New Jersey's mother is living far away and her health is not great. She has a strained relationship with her boyfriend. She is struggling to make ends meet. The Sandy who lives in the Philippines is struggling to meet her quotas, and she's struggling with the realization that although for her in her position this job might be good, it's also taking a lot of advantage of her. I enjoyed this book. I definitely was happy that I read it. These short stories are great palate cleansers or great books to read in between other things. They're usually about an hour to an hour and a half, maybe a little bit more sometimes, and it's really nice to be able to read a full book while I'm doing other work or while I'm closing my coffee shop. Definitely didn't feel as connected to this one as I have with other in these short story series. I will keep trying them. Some of them I'll really like and some of them I won't. The next book that I finished in March is Murder at the Brightwell. This is a historic mystery that I heard about early on in my time on BookTube and found only earlier this year at a Goodwill. This is about Amory Ames, who is well off society woman in 1930s London, and she and her husband have an extremely strained relationship. She's not really sure if she still loves her husband. She's not really sure if her husband still loves her. He is seen around town with many other women. He comes and goes as he pleases. And for the last 5 years, she's kind of put up with this behavior. She had previously been engaged to another man. His name was Gil. Although she never regretted not marrying him, she does wonder what would have happened if she married him instead of her husband, Milo. When Milo turns up at their country house, totally unexpectedly, she thinks it might be time to confront him, but suddenly Gil shows up at their country house totally unexpectedly, and instead of facing up to her marital problems, she goes with Gil to help him break up his sister and her fiance. She sees this trip to the Brightwell Hotel in Brighton, England as an opportunity to see what might have been with Gil. Unfortunately, when she gets to the Brightwell, things are not exactly how she expected, and the friend group that Gil has there are people that she doesn't really know, so she is not at ease when a murder occurs in the hotel. What she does know is that she has to investigate so that her good friends are not implicated in this crime. This book was very fluffy, very sweet, very cozy mystery, nothing untoward, no bad language, a little bit of romance, but no sex scenes or anything. I did enjoy it. I did enjoy my time with it. It was extremely quick, easy, fluffy, fun to get through. I didn't guess the murderer. I had a few guesses and I didn't know who it was. It's not a closed door mystery because although there is a tight friend group and only a few of those could have killed this person, there are other occupants to the hotel. I don't think this book was particularly well written. It was written by an American woman, and I think that she was overly concerned with trying to get across that these people were from England and had English accents and mannerisms. It was just a little stiff in parts. I also think that it was a little bit amateurish in many parts. It reminded me of a independently written book that I read earlier this year, Murder on the SS Rosa, in that it was amateurishly written and focused a lot on dress of the period, the furniture of the period, a lot on the opulence of ladies' evening wear and, you know, men's cufflinks, lighters and cigarette cases. Not that those things are bad, but I think even in my cozy mysteries, I want to be engaged a little bit more on a human level and on a level where real human emotions and struggles come into play. There was struggle, obviously, between married folks, people falling in love, falling out of love, but other than that, there was no more issues, no more challenging discussions to be had with this book. There was nothing that was so inspirational or engaging to make me think further than just reading this fluffy mystery. I'm not sure why this modern historical mystery hits me so differently than some of the mysteries that I read that were written in this time period, because maybe Agatha Christie doesn't have the most in-depth conversations about important topics and topical topics. They make so much more sense to me, and I don't require that from them. Whereas, even though this book was set in the 1930s, I feel like it needed a little more substance. Like I said, I did enjoy this book, and I'm glad to have read it. I would totally read more Ashley Weaver books. I would totally read more Amory Ames books if I happen to find them, but I will not be seeking out any of the sequels to this book. That was the third book that I read in March, and I'll get back to you when I read some more. It is March 10th. I finished just one more book in March so far. I finished The Visitors by Dodai Stewert. This was another one of those free short stories / novellas from a subscription in the same short story collection as Lila, which I read last month. So this is a nonfiction story about Dodai Smith's life. Dodai Smith lived in New York City, and this story is about her time as a late 20-year-old when she's trying to find love. She's used to dating and going out with friends, drinking. She's just really started her career. She is looking for love, so she goes on a dating app and finds a man that she connects with and is interested in, but he lives all the way in San Francisco. This story is about their time together, their relationship, and how the long distances between them affected her feelings and her experience. I don't want to say too much more about this because it is extremely short. It was about an hour and 15-minute audiobook. This was read by the author, and I do think that the reading was not as good as the reading of Lila, partly because I think the editing was very uneven. There seemed to be quite a few weird pauses and breaks between words or sentences where it seemed like they might have needed to edit out what the reader was reading and put in a new section, and it was just a little bit strange to listen to. I also didn't connect with this story as much as I connected with the story of Lila. In theory, I should have connected with this because I found my husband on an online dating site. I lived in New York, and I did like some of the aspects of it, definitely the parts about living and loving New York City, but it just felt very young to me. The writing and the way that she wrote about her time made her feel like a much younger person than a 29-year-old. I feel like some of the lessons that she learned were lessons that most people learn a lot earlier. Maybe not. Maybe that's just my experience, but I just didn't connect with this person, even though we have a lot of shared experiences. Overall, I liked it. I'm excited to read more from this short story collection. The next story that I downloaded is from the same collection. They're all kind of about people in their lives and experiences they've had with the one, whether that be friends or friendship or lovers or husbands and wives. So I'm interested to read more of that. I think based on this, I wouldn't really be interested in reading anything else by that author. That was one more book that I read in March. It is March 13th, and I have finished one more book in March. I finished Still Life by Louise Penny. This is a detective mystery set in Canada, and it follows Detective Gamache, who is a older detective. He's never really advanced too far in his police career because he is a little bit unorthodox. He is very much about collaboration. He's very much about teaching. He's very much about giving people second chances and being connected with his cases, which it seems like is difficult for everyone else involved in his detection because either they like and appreciate him but have to uphold the rules, or that they don't get him and they don't get his methods. He is called out unexpectedly on Thanksgiving, Canadian Thanksgiving weekend, to investigate a suspicious death. Older woman, a pillar of her community, but someone who kept quite to herself, has been found dead, and it's suspected that this was a hunting accident. There's a lot of hunting in the small woods surrounding Three Pines. They assume, because she's found on the hunting trail, that she was accidentally killed, but they're not sure what the weapon is. There was no weapon found at the scene, and there's some suspicious things about the death, like why it occurred only one day after it was announced that a painting of hers, of which she's never shown anyone, is going to appear in a local art show, and why her dog Lucy wasn't with her when she died. Gamache kind of treats this as a suspicious death, but he also is hoping it's a hunting accident. He's with his right-hand man, his sergeant, and he has brought on a new cadet with him to try and train her in his ways. ways. At first, she seems extremely promising, but as time goes by, she starts to wear thin on his patience and his second-in-command's patience. I really like this book. I've been wanting to read it ever since Kevy read it and really enjoyed it. I was interested in it before then just peripherally, but when she read it, I was like, oh, I really want to read this. I tried to start reading this a few months ago, but it's actually much more complicated and difficult than I had originally assumed. The writing is a little bit more elevated than a lot of cozy mysteries that I'm used to reading. A lot of the cozy mysteries are very simple, they're very straightforward, they're very short sentences. This has a lot more nuance to it and some difficult language in that there are French names and things like that, but more so just not written as plain and simple as a typical cozy mystery. I would say this is a cozy mystery in that there was violence and death, but it wasn't super overly gruesome. There was a little bit of like phobia talk, like snakes and things like that, but not super scary or gross. Nothing leaning towards like horror. One of the interesting things about the way this was written is that it is in omnipotent third person and you follow the thoughts of all different characters, which I thought was really interesting. The last book that I read that I would compare that particular part of the writing style to was Leave the World Behind by Ruman Alam. That book did this as well, where in the same chapter, in the same paragraph even, you might switch from Gramash to his second in command to one of the witnesses to one of the dogs involved in the story. And so I thought that was really interesting. Actually, I definitely shed a tear. There's one little passage from the victim's dog that is just so sweet and sad and poignant and amazing. Taken from the dog's perspective, it lent such a heavier, more sad relationship to her death than you had seen from any other character even though people were friends with her, even though people loved her. Seeing this dog's perspective really like broke my heart a little bit. I didn't guess the murderer. I actually fell for the red herring, so that's good. The red herring was well enough shrouded in mystery that you kind of thought that that was the real killer. I really enjoyed the descriptions of the little town. I liked that it was like a small town mystery. I really liked the setting being in Canada, which is something that I don't read a lot, and I've been wanting to read more Canadian authors, so I was really happy about that. And I definitely plan on keeping my eye out for the rest of the series. When I got this copy in a little free library, it actually had several of the other books in it, and they were all labeled with their appropriate number, which I loved. I don't think book 2 was in there, but I only took book 1 because I didn't know if I would like it. Since then, I've seen many copies of this book at little free libraries and at Goodwills and stuff like that, so I'm hoping it won't be too difficult to find the next book to be able to read that. But I really enjoyed this one. It was pretty chunky, but I flew through it. I just thought it was a really good, interesting take. Inspector Gramash has qualities of many other detectives that you might have read, but I feel like as a whole, he was quite a unique and interesting character to read from. That was the 5th book that I read in March. It is March 17th. And I have read 2 more books in March. I read A Wedding Thing, which is a very short novella / short story in the same short story series as The Visitor and Lila. This was about Shea and Larami and how they met, how they got married, and the tragedy and joy of their marriage and how it was quite unconventional. This was, I think, the weakest of the 3 books that I've read from that collection so far. This one was told by both the author, Shea, and his wife, Larami, which was cute, and it's about how each event that you go through together in a relationship means something different to the other person, or they see it from a different perspective, or they have a different recollection of it. It's an interesting idea, but similar to The Visitor, it didn't resonate with me in any way. Like, I didn't care at all. I thought that the writing was fine, but again, the author reads this short story, and so the audio was a little stilted and not overly engaging. It was totally fine. I could see how maybe, after reading 3 of these stories, I could see how maybe taking these stories as a whole, like as a collection, might make you like some of the weaker stories more, or maybe it's just like a short story collection that's not only on audio, and that some of them are going to be weak and some of them are going to be strong. Unfortunately, I've only seen one strong one from the ones that I've read so far out of this collection. And that was that. The next book that I finished in March was Maisie Dobbs by Jacqueline Winspear. This is a historical mystery, and I am reading it because it was on my BookTube Spin 5 Book 1, and I do have a vlog for Maisie Dobbs and Murder at the Brightwell. I read these two kind of in conjunction, and I always vlog all my BookTube Spin books, so you can see that vlog on my channel, and I will list it down below. Maisie Dobbs is about a young woman detective between the world wars in England. She worked as a nurse, and now she is retired from nursing, but she is on to being a detective. She had a detective mentor, Maurice, and was introduced to him by her former employee, who is a rich woman and often her patron. She was able to, at a very young age, start her education towards this very unorthodox and interesting means of detection. She's a little bit of a Dirk Gently in that all things are interconnected. She's a little bit of a Claire DeWitt in that her instincts and her intuition often lead her to the investigation that she takes and the solving of the investigation. She's also a little bit of a Will Graham from Hannibal in that she is able to kind of really take on and empathize with any person that she meets in a preternatural kind of way. She goes a little bit above and beyond just being empathetic, where she can pretty much like know what the other person is thinking. She's able to therefore draw information out of them or manipulate them into doing things that she wants them to do. This book follows some of her first cases on her own. Her mentor has retired, and she's now starting a practice all by herself. One of her ethos for taking cases is that she's going to see the case through to the end, not to when the client thinks the case is over, but when she thinks the case is over. And she's going to be mindful and careful of every member of that case, whether they are the person who's instigated the investigation or whether they're the person who is part of the investigation or whether they're the person being investigated by her. So she has a very holistic approach to detecting. This book starts out in that time period and then jumps backwards in time for the entire middle of the book, where we find out Maisie's history, how she hooked up with her former employee, now patron, and how she met her mentor. It also has to do with her time being a nurse in the war and the repercussions that that has had on her psyche and also on her practice. I have had this book for years and years and years. I got this book off a take a book, leave a bookshelf at one of my old coffee shops, one of my favorite places to work, and I had always intended to read it. It's moved with me at least 3 times, possibly 4 times. It's one of those books that for some reason I always held on to. So I was very happy to put it on BookTube Spin and have an excuse to finally get to it. I think one of the reasons that I didn't get to it before then is because I'm not much one for historical mysteries, and I'm not much one for books centered around the world wars. Now, I have come to realize that I do enjoy the time period between the 2 world wars much more than reading about actual war, and I'm actually a little bit more inclined to read books about World War I than I am to read books about World War II. I think this is partly because the themes and ideas held within those books are a little bit less cloyingly heart-tugging and specifically heartbreaking. World War I and World War II were absolutely heartbreaking, but I am more inclined to not like or not get along with books written about World War II, designed around the Holocaust. I'm glad that I finally did pick it up, but I have to say I did struggle with this book. I liked Maisie as a character. I liked that she was kind of a combination of those other detectives that I mentioned. I liked that she had her own way of detecting and that it was a much more mindful and well-rounded way of detecting. I thought that was interesting. I thought the initial mystery of one of her early clients was very interesting, and I did want to know the answer of that. But when we got to the middle section where she is a young girl, I found it incredibly repetitive, very long, not interesting at all. And about halfway through that section, I did actually skip about 60 pages of this book because it was putting me in a reading slump. I didn't want to read it. I really only wanted to find out what the conclusion to the initial mystery was, and I didn't really see any point in reading the minutia of her young life. So I skipped that, and then I did read the end of this book that continues on from the beginning and then does have some flashbacks to her past life. But honestly, those 60 pages, I don't think there was anything in there, not that I could tell from the end of the book, that I needed to know. Everything that I needed to know, the reasons why she split with a love interest, the reasons why she stopped nursing, were all told to me in this end part of the book anyway. So this middle part was very unnecessary. And if this end part had flashbacks and I was able to find out everything I needed to know, why did there need to be this whole middle part? Like, I think they could have cut out 100 pages of this book, added back in 50 pages of that in remembrance and flashbacks, and it would have been a much more dynamic and interesting book and a much less repetitive book. Overall, I'm glad I read this. I'm glad that this book that I've had for probably 20 years is off my TBR. It wasn't a favorite of mine. I don't think I'll be continuing on in this series. It's quite a long series. Maybe if I found a Maisie Dobbs book somewhere, I might see if the mystery sounded interesting and then I would read it. But if it's constructed the way this book was, I definitely would not pick it up. You can see more of my thoughts in my vlog. When I read some more, I'll let you know. It is March 24th, and I have finished one more book in March. I finished the Xmen Jazz by Julie Smith. This is one of her Skip Langdon series, all set in New Orleans. Skip Langdon is a New Orleans PD, and she has been recently promoted to homicide. The Xmen Jazz is the second in the series, and I have read book 1, book 2, and book 3 kind of out of order. In the first book, we see Skip as she is a new novice police officer, and she stumbles upon a case that by circumstance she happens to be near, and then because of her history of being a nouveau aristocratic family in New Orleans, she gets to investigate the murder that she stumbles upon. So she's kind of engulfed in the homicide world before her time, but that's really where she wants to be and what she wants to end up doing. So in this book, we see her newly appointed to homicide. One of the cops that she worked with in the previous book is now kind of the chief, and he has promoted her to homicide. She wants to do well for him and for herself and kind of prove herself, but she is still quite green. In this case, a young woman is murdered right before Skip is supposed to go on vacation with her long-distance boyfriend who she met in the first book. She decides to forego the vacation so that she can work on this case. When another murder happens with a similar MO, and that modus operandi is connected to an old serial killer, she knows she made the right decision even though she misses her boyfriend. The case leads her from person to person, from victim to victim, through 12-step programs, Alcoholics Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous. It leads her through having to role play and perhaps having to push the limits of what she's supposed to be doing as a police officer. I don't know, this was an interesting one. I really like and appreciate Julie Smith's book because all three of the books that I've read are cozy mysteries. They're not super crazy violent. There's not a lot of blood and gore, but they do also have some deeper conversations within them. Because these are set and written in the 90s, there are definitely problematic elements. I think Smith is also tackling things that maybe are overlooked or ignored a lot, like racial integration, like racism, like interracial marriage and relationships. And in this book, she's talking about or examining the idea of the 12-step programs, OA, AA, codependency, all sorts of those programs and places where people are supposed to recover, and she sets her murders kind of around that idea. But there's a lot of interesting conversation to be had about what is codependency? Are those 12-step programs helpful? How does religion integrate with those things? How do people with past traumas recover from those traumas? And are places like the 12-step program helpful for that? I don't think that's the overall intent of her books to examine those things, but I think there is some examination of things in all her books, and specifically of that in this book. I think this was the weakest of the books that I've read from her. It almost suffered from like middle book syndrome. In the first book, we've already figured out who Skip Langdon is and what a lot of her motivations are, and her relationship with her family, her relationship with her boyfriend, her relationships within the police department, both good relationships and adversarial relationships. So in this book, you kind of don't have anything new really to learn about her. We're just kind of coasting along on what we do know. I think Smith puts some new information in there, but there's always kind of the like will they won't they with her boyfriend. There's always the kind of is her police job too much to have a relationship? Is their long distance fling too much? There's always the presence of the adversarial relationship with her family. It's kind of just like solidifying who she is and what her role is, and that she's a good cop. We know she's a good cop, but this is like her realizing she's a good cop and her kind of coming into her own confidence, because in the first book she's very self-conscious and not confident about her abilities because she is so green and new, whereas this one she's really realizing that she does have these abilities and that she is a capable cop. I think also the 12-step program conversation and that aspect of the book was really interesting to Julie Smith, and she did a lot of research on that, and she probably liked that topic, but it seemed like the mystery was kind of rushed through. Like she wanted to hit all these steps, but then like the end where the case is solved was kind of just rushed through. And I do think there was a little bit of moral to the story of the idea that this bad things happen, and even when you're trying to recover and even when you're trying to do good, bad things can still happen to you. The moral of the story is kind of like, even though times are dark, you have to find the light. It was just the actual ending, I think, was quite rushed. I think it was fairly easy to guess who the killer was, even though, again, there weren't really enough clues for you to be able to tell, but you kind of had a feeling, and it was a little bit one of those, this person's too good to be true solves. This person couldn't possibly be who they say they are, so they're not. And it just wasn't a great mystery. I think it was an interesting story. I love the New Orleans setting, of course, but it just fell a little flat. So I think that the third in the series, which was the first book that I read, was stronger than this one. So I'm interested to see if and when I ever pick up the fourth book, what that one is like. That was the next book that I read in March. It is March 29th, and I have finished one more book in March. I finished The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. This was written by Peniel E. Joseph, and it is a dual biography of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. I read Malcolm X's autobiography last year, and I loved it, and I'm getting a little bit overly emotionally involved in the life of Malcolm X. I think he was a really interesting historic figure and a great man. And this biography tells his story and also the parallel biography of Martin Luther King Jr., another American man working towards civil rights in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Martin Luther King is more well known. There's a federal holiday in the US pertaining to his life, and he was known for his stance of nonviolence as a civil rights tool. He was known for civil disobedience, but non-violence, for gaining humane rights for Black people and other people of color. I know a lot less about Martin Luther King, so I was really interested to read this dual biography, and I was also really interested in the idea that these two men had a huge impact on the United States, had a huge impact on civil rights, had a huge impact on the Black community, and they were working at the same time towards a very similar, if not the same, goal, and yet they only met once in their lifetime. Both these men were revered, and both of these men were assassinated ostensibly by anti-Black movements or anti-civil rights movements, but probably the US government. I just thought it was really interesting to see their lives paralleled, how they were raised differently, how they came to the conclusion of civil rights differently, how they took different paths to get civil rights, but ultimately how they had a very similar goal. I found this book free on an audio site, and I had never heard of it before, but it's a subject that I'm really interested in, so I was happy to start listening to it on audio. I really liked the reader, who I believe is an actor, and he does the voices for the different people involved. So not only for Malcom X does he have a voice, not only for Martin Luther King, but he also has a voice for some of the other players around the time of these two men in the civil rights movement, Bobby Kennedy and other famous figures that you may or may not know. I do think that this book was a little overly academic. It felt very much like someone's college dissertation that they expanded into a book. It had like a thesis in the beginning, and then it had like a conclusion at the end. It was very much about like dates and times and very specific things that happened in these men's lives regarding the civil rights movement, which was really interesting, but it was told in many times in a very academic way, so that it was a little bit dry and a little bit forgettable. So their actions and their deeds weren't forgettable, but the way this book was told, it was a little bit difficult to keep track of exactly when things happened, exactly what happened, exactly every tiny aspect of these great political men's lives. But overall, I think it told a really great and interesting story, not only about, again, these men's lives growing up, their childhoods, how they were raised, their religious statuses, and how religion impacted their lives and their impact on the civil rights movement, but also about all the political ins and outs and intrigue of the different ways that they were connected with the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was a preacher and had a lot of Christian aspects to his quest for rights, but he was a very well-known womanizer and wasn't very respectful of women in the movement, and that hindered him a lot in his career. Malcom X famously converted to be an American Muslim and then later to become a traditional Muslim, and it's really interesting to see how the religion affected these men's lives, and how, although they had what some would consider very different religions, they had very similar religious upbringings, they ended up in different religions, but their religion did not hinder, I don't think, in any way, their quest for Black lives to be acknowledged to be important, and Black rights and rights of people of color. I also think it was interesting that Malcom X is thought of as being very violent. Even though he didn't advocate violence, he only advocated self-defense, whereas Martin Luther King is very well known for being a pacifist and nonviolent, specifically nonviolent, often compared to Gandhi. But as these men's lives changed and as they came to certain realizations, they not only kind of got on the same page, but maybe went a little in the other direction for some aspects of their fight for civil rights. These men only met once in their entire lives, which is amazing. It's an interesting story, and this book has some of the backstory about why that would be. It also tells a lot about other players at that time and other people who were involved, specifically James Baldwin, who knew both men and got along with both men and revered both men, and later wrote a similar essay about these two men and their lives and how they are connected. So I'd really love to read that James Baldwin essay. I definitely enjoyed this book. I would highly recommend this book. I think it helped me to have read Malcolm X's autobiography first, so I think it would have been helpful for me to have read more about Martin Luther King first as well. This is one that I definitely want to read again because it is so many facts and dates and times and nuances of political actions. I think having more context and coming back to this book after I've read some of the other books about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, this book will be even more impactful and interesting and give me an even more set feeling of time and space. It is April 1st, and I have finished the last book in March. I finished this a few days ago, and this was The Third Life of Grange Copeland by Alice Walker. Alice Walker is most famous for The Color Purple, which was made into a movie and is very well known and well renowned. This is actually her first novel. I picked this copy up from a free little library, and I got it for TBR Tackle. This was my March TBR Tackle book. TBR Tackle is a super fun booktube game run by Kieran at Katie Books. It's one of my all-time favorite booktube games, a great way to get through your TBR, and I vlog every TBR Tackle book that I read, so you can see that vlog before you see this vlog. This book is about Grange Copeland, but it is also, and a little bit more so, about his son Brownfield. Grange Copeland and his wife and son are living in the South. They're working for white cotton farm owners, plantation owners, and they are struggling. Grange especially is dealing with alcoholism. He's dealing with fear of the white farm owners, and although he is not technically a slave, he is indebted to these farmers to the extent that he is pretty much their slave. He's taken to drink, beating his wife, ignoring his son Brownfield, passing down a lot of his unhappiness and depression to his family. Each person in his family chooses a different way to deal with this, and when Grange leaves the family, they all go their separate ways. We mostly follow Brownfield as he grows up. He leaves his home and he leaves the shack on the plantation where he and his parents had lived, and he goes to go to Harlem or go to Chicago or find some way to take control of his life as a black man. He doesn't make it that far though, unfortunately, and he ends up only a few towns over from where he grew up. Although he has a lot of hope and potential for his life, although he finds a woman and falls in love, he unfortunately ends up continuing the cycle of abuse and depression and alcoholism, just like his father did, ends up beating his wife and his children, abusing and neglecting them to extreme measures. When Grange very unexpectedly comes back into his life, they are faced with the reality of having to decide whether this cycle is something that they can change and something that they can look inward to change, or something that is bestowed upon them. I really like this book. It was definitely a tough read, but there's something about the way these books are written. This one, the book by Gloria Naylor I've read, the book by Toni Morrison I've read, there's something about how these black female authors write about men and men's lives, but really write about the resilience of the women in those lives, and how the black woman and the black female experience is much harder in a way, but also have so much more power in a way. These strong black women are doing things like creating their own businesses and bearing children and working and trying to break this cycle of poverty and oppression. That's really what this book is about, although it is all couched in the story of these two men. Look up trigger warnings for this book, but I would say if you are interested in that, especially by women who were writing in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, I would definitely suggest giving Alice Walker a try. I have another one of her books that I'm really excited to read as well. I think this was a stark and plainly written book. So was the book that I read by Gloria Naylor, but that almost gives it so much more of an impact to me that I definitely highly recommend it. So that was the 10th book that I read in March. I read a little bit less in March than I did in January and February, but I still read quite a bit. It was still a great reading month. I was able to read a couple of books by people of color. I was able to read some nonfiction. I was able to read some literary fiction. I was able to read a few of those short stories. March was March Mystery Madness, so I read quite a few mysteries. I read my TBR Tackle book, which was not a mystery in March. And then I read my BookTube Spin book, which was a mystery in March. And you can see the vlog for those listed down below. I was also able to get to one of the books that I've had on my TBR for a long time, which is a mystery set in New Jersey. I was able to read one of the Skip Langdon mysteries, which is set in New Orleans. So I think my reading was quite diverse. I definitely ended up reading a lot of mysteries for March Mystery Madness. I will be doing a quarterly readathon wrap-up, which will have my readathon info for January, February, and March. That will be coming out this month, where I go through all the prompts for all the readathons I've done and let you know what books I read and how they fit in. It's partly for you, but it's partly for me so that I remember. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I read in March. Let me know if you have a favorite mystery or what your favorite book from your March reading month was. And I will see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye. Of course, a great reading month. I don't know if I've ever had like a bad reading month. They're all so good.